I'm Deborah Darnell, and this is Bonnie Scudder, and we're going to give you a brief history of the Staunton family and the Staunton Ranch.
Okay, the Staunton family. We will begin with Dr. Archibald Staunton. He was born in 1868 in West Virginia, and he died in 1958. He was the youngest son in a family of 10 children. His father also was a physician, and he was known, Archie was known as a very fine physician. He always was seen in his suit and his tie, and he wore galoshes around the ranch all of the time. He loved this ranch very, very much, and he also enjoyed writing poetry. And so you will see one of his poems over at the Visitor Center. The next one is his wife, Dr. Rachel Hornbrook Bullard Staunton. She was born around 1869. We're not sure of the exact date because they didn't have birth certificates at that time. She also was born in West Virginia in Wheeling. She graduated from the Women's Medical College of Philadelphia in 1894, practiced medicine in Charleston, West Virginia, and married Archibald on December 30th, 1898. Rachel had a very deep and caring nature. She was a very empathetic person and was very highly respected and deeply loved by all of her patients, her family, and her friends. And if there's one person I would like to meet, it would be Dr. Rachel. I think she was really an amazing person. The third member of the Staunton family is Miss Frances Staunton. And we have a picture of Frances as a little girl. This was taken back probably in Maryland, where she was born. And she grew up to be an opera star. And so we have a picture of her in one of her lead roles in the opera. So Frances was born in Maryland. She was the only child in the Staunton family. She attended school in Denver at Emerson Elementary and East High School, graduating in 1919. She later won a full scholarship to the Juilliard School in New York. She went there, I think it was a 2-year scholarship. She went there for 1 year. She was so miserably homesick for her parents and the ranch that she came back, and she didn't finish her education there. She later received her BA and her master's degree from the University of Denver, and her major was voice. She did have a beautiful voice, and she sang lead contralto roles in the Denver operas and performed at the Denver Auditorium Theater, which is now the L.A. Calkins Opera House. Frances was very, very devoted to her parents. She cared for her mother after her mother was very badly injured in an automobile accident. Rachel was driving her car up here and somebody hit her. It was not her fault, but she wasn't able to walk and she was laid up, and Frances was the one who took care of her mother. The last 7 years of Rachel's life, she was an invalid. She died of heart failure, and she was bedridden, and Frances devoted her time to her mother. After her mother passed, then Frances served as chauffeur for her father, driving him to his appointments. So they arrived in Colorado, first of all, in 1903. They were looking for a drier climate for Archibald's health. He was suffering, they said, from pneumonia, but it might have been tuberculosis. You just didn't mention those things in those days. So Archie came out on the train to Denver. He was headed to California. It had a layover, and it was February. And he had taken the trolley out to City Park and had sat down on the ground and then noticed that the ground was dry. And that was quite remarkable because he was used to a very humid climate. So he probably wired Rachel, who probably took the next train out, and they looked around, decided that this is where they wanted to settle. So they applied for their medical licenses in 1903 and then moved here in 1906, settling in the Capitol Hill region in Denver. So they set up their practices, and then in 1910, they purchased this lovely Victorian mansion that is on Downing Street, Colfax and Downing. It is still standing. That's a picture that Deborah and I took just a few years ago when we visited it. And so they lived there. This house remained in the family until Frances died in 1989. And Frances was born in she was born in 1899, and she died in 1989. It's a bit of a tongue twister there. The Stauntons homesteaded 680 acres in the Elk Creek Valley beginning in 1918. The first acquisition was 80 acres and a small cabin, which was purchased from Stephen Blaine in 1918.
The Staunton Ranch, they didn't refer to it as the Staunton Ranch. They called it the Lazy V Ranch. And we think V, we don't know for sure, but could have stood for the Virginias, since they came from the Virginias. And so that's as good as we can get. But they did call it the Lazy V, and the V was on its side,
right,
being lazy. You didn't mention the National Historic Landmark.
I didn't know.
Okay.
No.
So do you want to just say something about that real quick?
Oh, okay. Well, in 2011, Jen Anderson was the manager of the park, and she wanted to hire some volunteers, right, to work on a designation of the ranch buildings so that eventually the cabins could be restored and grants could be written and funded to pay for that restoration, and that's where we are today. So I talked her into hiring 2 people because it wouldn't cost her anything more, and so she hired a person who was getting a master's in historic preservation and architecture, and I was the local person, and so we started immediately researching the Staunton cabin and putting together information to write the application for National Historic Landmark designation, and that was granted on these buildings on the Staunton Ranch on December 4th of 2012.
Great.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the 7 buildings that comprise the landmark. You want to point to
Yes.
the Richardson cabin? I thought that you could see it walking from the maintenance to the Staunton cabin. You can't because of this new berm that they put up. So crane your necks and walk down a little bit further, and that's the first cabin that you come to. It is the largest cabin, and it is 2 stories. It was constructed by a Scotsman to begin with, and he built it for his workshop. The Stauntons called all of these buildings something different. They called the Richardson cabin Mushroom. And the park calls it Richardson's cabin because the Richardson family came from Louisiana every summer and stayed in it, rented it from the Staunton family for many, many years. So, and it's properly adorned in snow for today. The next cabin is the Blaine cabin. This is the oldest cabin, oldest building on the Staunton property, and it was homesteaded earlier. We think it probably dates back to about 1890. The Blaine family, Bessie and Stephen, purchased the 80 acres and the homesteaded cabin. And it, in a big windstorm, 2 trees fell down on it, collapsing the roof on the kitchen area, and a couple of volunteers worked on maintaining that roof line and sort of trying to mend it until it could be fixed properly. But it is at least keeping the weather out now. The next building that you come to, and this is on the other side of the building, there's a trail juncture, and this is the shower house. And this, we think, was built back for the doctors to take care of TB patients up here. And they advertised, they used it for the children's camps that they had, and Bonnie will talk about those later on, but they even advertised hot showers, which I know on a day like today sounds pretty good. The next cabin is a one-room cabin, very tiny, Brola cabin. The Brolas, Jean Brola was Frances's good friend and her voice coach. And so they would come up, she and her husband would come up many times during the summer and stay in this little cabin. But because she was friends with Frances, we think probably that she spent a lot of time over at Frances's cabin. Okay, and then the Staunton cabin, which you know better than having cleaned this yesterday. I've never been inside, so you know more about that. Stauntons called it Wildwood, and it was completed in August of 1918, and the following summer they added on. Does the kitchen sound like what they would have added on? Okay, then, great. And then the policeman's cabin is a little further out, and the Stauntons referred to this as Left Fork. And we think they called it Left Fork because it's on the left fork of what would be the Black Mountain Creek. And the park calls it Policeman's Cabin. A Denver policeman lived there in exchange for offering security to the Stauntons and also some caretaking jobs. The bunkhouse, here we go. This is a picture of it before it got the wooden outside put over the log exterior, and you might want to come up and look at these pictures afterwards. The bunkhouse was built by Archie. He purchased 160 acres and a sawmill in 1930. This was built later because we know that from his tax forms. The sawmill stopped operation during World War II and never went back into operation.
Okay, so there were a variety of activities that took place on the ranch, and this was one of the things that we had to research for the application for National Historic Designation. Logging had taken place on the ranch and on that land probably since the 1860s from stories that we had heard when we were purchasing our land from the people who'd owned it for 35 years nearby. But we were told that Norwegian and Swedish loggers had come to the area and had started logging back in the late 1860s. And there were Norwegian people that were in the area and probably some Swedish people as well. We know that in 1904, a man named Jesse Ray had homesteaded 80 acres, and that is up where the bunkhouse was. And actually, there was a picture of a building that was part of his sawmill there. So he was doing sawyering back in 1904, probably before that, and he continued in the area for close to 20 years. We've recently located some historic photos of that. So, you know, even though we're done with the visitor center and so on, our research continues and we continue to learn things all the time, very interesting things. The sawmill ran until about 1942 and then it closed because of World War II. We do know pretty much for sure, we can't totally prove it, but we certainly have strong evidence that tuberculosis was treated here. As I interviewed local people, and we had been told by the former owners of our land that there had been a TB sanitarium up here and that the doctors had treated TB patients. Rachel was the one who homesteaded the land. She lived here for 7 months of the year and treated patients. She delivered babies. She also supposedly treated animals. Some people had heard that she was the local veterinarian, and so on. We had interviewed, I had the opportunity with Dick to interview Gasper Perricone. He was a judge, and he had been very, very largely responsible for Frances donating this land to the state of Colorado to become a state park. And Gasper had told me, and he was her attorney, he had told me that, yes, Frances had confided in him that the shower house was built for the patients with tuberculosis. And we had it from other sources as well, so we do think that that happened. That happened from about 1918, most likely when Rachel started living on the land, to around 1938, because Rachel was getting sick by then. And penicillin was being developed, and so they were finding cures for tuberculosis, so they weren't needing the sanitariums. So the Stauntons had tax bills coming in on all this land that they owned, and they had all of these cabins, and summer camps for children were becoming popular, so they turned them into summer camps for children. But I think they forgot to mention that it had been a TB sanitarium before, which is understandable. You might not want to send your children to summer camp if they were going to be staying in cabins where patients with tuberculosis had stayed. So they did have summer camps for children. The Girl Scouts had their first camps for children in Colorado for girls at the Staunton Ranch. They rented the ranch out and held that for 3 years until they were able to buy their own property. There were a variety of other groups that hosted camps for boys and camps for girls. And the last one that we found was the Mount Marion Camp for Catholic Girls, which held their big camp at the Staunton Ranch in 1954. So we know that it was used for camps at least through 1954. They also rented the cabins to tourists and, of course, had family and friends come stay. And the rentals probably started during the cabin, probably not during the TB era, I'm guessing, but probably during the summer camp. If they weren't rented, then they would rent them out to other people. They would have families that would come for years, for decades, every summer to stay in the Richardson cabin or the Blaine cabin, in their favorite cabin. Cabins were still rented out when Frances turned the land over to the state of Colorado in 1986. Okay.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about homesteading. It has a lot of requirements. Some of you might, know about it. Think of it more happening in the Midwest, the big Oklahoma opening territory, but homesteading was very, very active in Colorado. And so you had to build a cabin, and later you can come up and see Rachel's actually standing there. She looks like she's out in the middle of nowhere. And maybe she felt she was when Archibald would go back to Denver. So they had to build a cabin. They had to raise livestock. And their idea of livestock was a cow, a couple of burros, a couple of horses to pull the plow, some chickens and ducks. Might not sound like a lot of livestock to you, but these were city folk, and I guess it met the requirements. So that was the livestock that they raised. They also had to raise crops. They cleared 10 acres of land and built terraces. You can see those nice terraces still in existence today down below the cabin area. And make sure to walk down and see those. And they raised predominantly oats and potatoes. And the first year, 1920, that they have to do a report every year, an annual report showing what they're accomplishing. And that's part of the Homestead Act. They said in 1920, 40 bushels of potatoes. They were so proud. 1921. 10 bushels. So maybe it wasn't such a great year. Or maybe they didn't put in manure and things. So anyway.
This is Frances. She was very tall. Frances was about 6 feet tall. And this is Rachel. And we don't know who those guys are. Archie's not there.
Okay.
And talk about this one.
Oh, you can go ahead and talk about it, Bonnie.
This was the doctor's temporary cabin. This was one of the photos we found, and all of this was in the Staunton collection at History Colorado. And this was in one of the photo albums there. So they had built this little cabin out of tar paper, and this is where they saw patients until they were able to get the cabins built and have an inside place. So that was the doctor's temporary cabin.
You know the cabin interior better than I do. I've never been inside, but you can come up again and look at these pictures later. They did have a living room. You, I'm sure, saw the large fireplace. And then there was, to the side, there was a music room. They had a piano and a pump organ because music was very important. They also had a big-horned Victrola here. So they had lots of music going on in the cabin. There was a sitting room with big comfortable sofas and pillows and all sorts. And the kitchen, I guess that stove is still in there? Yeah, okay. And then did you go upstairs? Sleeping area upstairs, so just wide open. Maybe they hung blankets to make it into bedrooms or something like that. I was talking to Bonnie on the way out, and she said that there was a bedroom of sorts that Rachel used downstairs sometimes.
That we think
too,
she probably did.
Okay.
I wanted to say something about this picture. I was so excited when I found this picture. It was a little picture about this size. There were about 4 of them, and it had been sent by probably this lady, who was probably a friend of the family. But here is Archibald in his suit. And I'm not sure, it looks like he doesn't have galoshes on there. And this is Rachel in her rocking chair over here. But this was the first time we had seen a picture that showed what the cabin looked like and that showed them inside the cabin. And the resolution on the picture was really good. It was really amazing.
Okay.
The cabin was donated to the state of Colorado, and this was in large part due to Judge Perricone, who was a judge at that time, was no longer her lawyer because he was a judge. But before Rachel had died, the family had talked about what should Frances do with this beautiful ranch, and they had talked about the different possibilities, and they were seeing that land was being sold off, and there were housing developments going in, and they did not want that to happen to this beautiful land. They felt that the land had come from the government because they had homesteaded much of the property, and all of the area at one point had been homesteaded by somebody. But they wanted this land to be preserved so that everybody could enjoy it. And so they decided that it should be a state park if the parks would accept it. And Judge Perricone was very involved later on when he became her attorney after Archie died and led her in that direction. So they had decided that it should be there, and so we took some words from her will and put that on the visitor center in the atrium along with portraits of the 3 Stauntons. And so we abstracted it because it was a very long, wordy will, and so we chose to say, I give to the state of Colorado my property for use as a state park to be known as Staunton State Park, to be preserved essentially as a wilderness area. At least 90% of the area is to be left in its natural state, typifying Colorado's most beautiful mountain forest and meadow region.
Okay. So the gift was given. You got the gift given. The donation was took place in 1986, and the pink area there is the 1,700 acres. This is Elk Creek Road. The rest of the area around the pink area is private property, so you can see there was no entrance. There was no way to get the visitors who wanted to come through the private property. The owners didn't want them to come through. So there was, this problem. So, and also the state felt that this 1,700 acres wasn't quite large enough for a state park. So, and I'm answering the question, why did it take from 1986 to 2013 to open? This is my answer. And there's a display in the visitor center with more information. In 1999, they purchased the area that Bonnie's pointing to, Elk Falls Ranch, and that about doubled the area. The road does go up to it, but guess what? To get to it, you would have to drive through private property to get to it. So the people didn't want that again, made sure that the state knew that, and so there was still a problem. But with this area, what we got was Elk Falls, Lion's Head, the pond with the sportsman's cabin, the areas that are really special about the park.
This is part of that area.
So that was a great purchase. In 1999, they also purchased Davis Ranch. The Davis parents had passed away, leaving 3 sons to split up the property. 2 of the 3 sons decided to sell to the state, and they sold this white area here. You can see now we can enter off Elk Creek Road. Fantastic. One brother kept the property, and the beautiful barn and ranch
right
house
here.
that you see as you drive in is still private property owned by the 3rd Davis brother. Okay, so we can get in, drive in, but if we build the visitor center here, people want to hike. People want to get out and hike and get exercise, but they also want to take the shortest way possible. We would have had to go all the way around. Okay, so in this small piece of property here was 80 acres owned by Mary Coyle Chase. That name may sound familiar to some of you, and it's because she wrote a play, Harvey, that became the movie with Jimmy Stewart. A few of you younger people may not have seen that. Do see it. It's about a man who has an imaginary giant rabbit as a friend. He drinks a little too much. Okay, so, and she always said that this was the property that Harvey bought. And so she died, and her son sold that 80 acres. Now we can put a trail right in through here and walk into the beauty of the park. We still have one in-holding, private in-holding here of 80 acres. But the park can open, you can drive in, you can walk in. So we've got the park opened in May of 2013. We were very fortunate to have the 80 acres gifted to the park at the end of 2014. Mr. Alan Dines, he was a lawyer in Denver and quite a politician. He
State
was,
legislator and state rep.
yeah, and he was in his 90s, and he was living in Florida with his second wife, and he decided, they were in the process of saying the park would have first rights to buy it, and they could probably use it, and the lawyers were going back and forth. And he sat there and thought, I'm going to give this to the park. And he did. So that, now we had a complete open area. We have one more piece of property, and most of you have hiked through the park. And you know, when you go along Staunton Ranch, the name of the trail changes to Bugling Elk. It's because you're going into Pike National Forest, and there are entering National Forest and leaving National Forest signs. And so there is that part. The state has purchased 160 acres from the Berrien family. Some of you local people probably recognize that name. They own a lot of property. And so that 160 acres is now proposed to swap out with the National Forest. So this area here will be part of the park. but the state, those wheels move very slowly. If anybody has any pull, you can put it in there and tell somebody from the state that we'd like it sooner than later. But anyway, that's the only other, basically there's something like 500 homes around the park. So, you know, we're pretty landlocked, and then with the cliffs. Okay.
So how many of you have been to Elk Falls? How many of you haven't been to Elk Falls?
Okay.
Oh, you've got to go. This is a picture that we are convinced is a picture of Dr. Rachel and Francis. We believe it was taken in, in fact, we know that it was taken in 1919 and published in the Denver Quarterly magazine, I think it was, as a tourism feature. And so we're sure it's called Two Girls Dancing at Elk Falls, and the picture is on the internet, and it's at Denver Public Library and so on. First on my bucket list was going here, and I was able to go there about 6 years ago, and it was absolutely incredible. So be sure to go there if you have a chance.